May it please the court? February 14th, St. Valentine's Day, Cupid's holiday, a day of love, a day for lovers, a day when probably more than any other day, 3 little words are spoken. And when they're exchanged by significant others, those 3 little words are usually followed up by some cute little pet name. Well, on February 14th, 2015, 3 little words were spoken. And they were spoken by a significant other, and they were followed by a name. But the 3 little words spoken on February 14th, 2015 weren't the 3 little words typically expressed on Valentine's Day. And the significant other in this case was significant in a whole different way. So on February 14th, 2015, Sarah Lazar and her husband Sidney Lazar were spending Valentine's Day as most couples do. They were spending it together. Mr. and Mrs. Lazar owned a clothing store, and they were together working in that store on Valentine's Day 2015. Unfortunately for them, February 14th, 2015 would be the last Valentine's Day that Mr. and Mrs. Lazar spent together. And that's because at about 3:15 p.m., this defendant and the significant other in this case entered Lazar's clothing store. This defendant approached Mr. and Mr. Lazar as they were sitting at the counter, and so Mr. Lazar asked if there was anything he could do for him. That's when this defendant put his hand in his jacket and pulled out a gun and demanded that they give him all the money. Mrs. Lazar, of course, terrified by having a gun pointed in her face, began to yell. And that's when 3 little words were spoken by a significant other in this case. That's when Del Buckner yelled, "Shut her up." But not only did he say, "Shut her up," he followed that by a name. His exact words were, "Shut her up, Johnny." And that's exactly what this defendant, Johnny Hudson, did. He shut her up. In fact, he shut her up permanently by putting a bullet through her brain. And as soon as he shot her, he and Dale bolted out the store and ran right past Richard Green, who was on his way into the store. Mr. Green saw the men run past him, run down and jump into a dark, big sedan with this defendant driving the getaway car. Mr. Green then went into the store and saw Ms. Lazar laying bloody on the ground. He immediately called for help, and within a few minutes, Officer Sam Riley arrived. Mr. Lazar, of course, very upset and shaken, wasn't able to give any detail about the assailants. But in fact, he told Officer Riley that there was nothing really unusual about the men. But he was able to add or to express that the assailants were 2 young adult white men and that they were both wearing black leather jackets. And Mr. Green was able to add that he saw the gentleman jump into a late modeled black sedan. That same afternoon, Officer Riley asked Mr. Lazar to come to the station to look through some pictures to see if he could identify the 2 men who robbed and killed his wife. Mr. Lazar looked through a stack of maybe 50 or more photos, and he noticed 2 men who he thought could be the assailants. But Mr. Lazar wanted to be certain, so he asked if he could see the 2 men in person. Officer Riley then did a quick search for the addresses for both of the men, and lo and behold, the 2 men shared the same address. After doing a little more digging, Officer Riley was able to get an arrest warrant for the 2 men. And later that same night, on February 14th, maybe shortly after midnight, so going into February 15th, Officer Riley and a few other officers went to the 2 people's apartment who Ms. Lazar had identified. Because the men were considered armed and dangerous, the officers did a no-knock entry into the apartment and found this defendant and his roommate, Dale Buckner, asleep in a shared bedroom, but in separate beds. And in the nightstand between the bed, Officer Riley recovered a .38 caliber handgun. The gun smelled of oil and seemed to have recently been cleaned. And later, a ballistics expert was able to confirm that, in fact, the gun had recently been cleaned. So he wasn't able to confirm whether it had recently been fired. And because the .38 caliber bullet that was removed from Mrs. Lazar's body was so badly damaged, the ballistics expert also couldn't determine whether the bullet was fired from the .38 caliber handgun that was retrieved from this defendant's apartment. But when Officer Riley seized the weapon from the apartment as John and Dale were being arrested, he told them that they wouldn't be using that gun on anybody else, to which Dale responded, "If you mean that old lady, no way," which caused this defendant to say, "Shut up, John, shut up, Dale, you still talk too much." After their arrest, Officer Riley had this defendant and his roommate get dressed so that he could escort them to the police station. And in putting on his pants and shirt, this defendant also put on a black leather jacket. Then, as Officer Riley was leaving the apartment, he noticed a black Cadillac sedan outside the building that fit the description that Mr. Green had given of the getaway car. Officer Riley proceeded to run the plates on the car, and that black Cadillac sedan came back registered to this defendant, Johnny Hudson. After the defendants were taken to the station, Officer Riley called Mr. Lazar and Mr. Green and asked if they come back to the station to view a lineup. Mr. Lazar arrived first and was sitting in a waiting room when he saw this defendant and Dale Buckner being escorted in handcuffs by Officer Riley. Mr. Lazar immediately recognized Johnny and Dale as the men who attempted to rob the store and who had murdered Mrs. Lazar. Would the state have preferred that Mr. Lazar had not seen the defendants until they were actually presented in the lineup? Yes. But did Mr. Lazar seeing them prior to the actual lineup affect his subsequent positive identification? No. Remember, it was Mr. Lazar's initial photo identification of Johnny and Dale from a stack of about 50 pictures or so that led to their arrest. Once Mr. Green arrived to the station, he was placed in the room with Mr. Lazar, and Johnny and Dale were placed in a lineup with 3 other white males of approximately the same height, age, and weight. The men weren't placed in any particular order, and in fact, Officer Riley told Johnny and Dale that they could stand in any order they wanted to. And once they had selected their location, Officer Riley went and got Mr. Green and Mr. Lazar and brought them in the room and had each of the 5 men involved in the lineup to turn around and speak those 3 little words followed by that name. "Shut her up, Johnny." Then Officer Riley asked Mr. Lazar and Mr. Green if they recognized any of them. Mr. Lazar was first to identify this defendant and his roommate, Dale, as the 2 men who entered his store and killed his wife. Then Mr. Green identified Johnny and Dale as the men he saw dash past them and jump into a black large sedan, the same type of car owned by this defendant, Johnny. After Johnny was arrested and booked, he waived his Miranda rights and then denied any involvement in Mrs. Lazar's murder. He denied having any knowledge of the gun recovered from the apartment, but he said it must belong to Dale, even though he and Dale had never discussed the gun. And without being asked anything about a black leather jacket, this defendant volunteered that the jacket seized from his and Dale's apartment also belonged to Dale, and denied ever owning a jacket similar to that. As for his whereabouts on Valentine's Day 2015, Johnny claimed that he and Dale had drove his black Cadillac to a chicken joint in their old neighborhood at about 2:00 p.m. and just hung around there until after 3:30 p.m. The drive time from Lazar's clothing store to the chicken joint is about 15 minutes. Johnny's attorney got a written statement from a guy named William Barr, who claims that he also was at the chicken joint on Valentine's Day 2015, and that he was there from about a little after 3 p.m. until shortly before 3:30 p.m. Mr. Barr claims that he chatted with Johnny and Dale for 15 to 20 minutes while he waited for his chicken. Mr. Barr has known Johnny and Dale for a long time because they all grew up in the same neighborhood. And while he claims that Johnny and Dale weren't close friends, and that he tried to stay away from them because, in his words, they were rough guys who were always getting into trouble, Mr. Barr also stated that he had been to a couple of parties at Johnny's and Dale's apartment just within the past few months, and that he had been in every room in that apartment, that same apartment where Johnny and Dale were arrested on Valentine's night 2015. Mr. Barr admits that Johnny, his not-so-close friend, wrote him a letter from jail just a week after his arrest and denied killing Mrs. Barr. Unfortunately for all of us, Mr. Barr failed to keep the letter, so there's no evidence of what else Johnny wrote in his letter to his not-so-close friend. So, ladies and gentlemen of this jury, despite this defendant's denial of any involvement in the crimes for which he is charged, in the statement submitted by Mr. William Barr purportedly providing Johnny Hudson with an alibi, the evidence in this case will prove that, in fact, defendant Johnny Hudson, along with the significant other in this case, Johnny's roommate, Dale Butner, entered Lazar's clothing store on Valentine's Day 2015 with the intent to rob the store. But when the victim, Sarah Lazar, screamed out in terror because Johnny Hudson pointed a .38 caliber handgun at her and her husband, Dale Butner said, "Shut her up, Johnny." And the evidence will prove that this defendant, Johnny Hudson, did just that by shooting Mrs. Lazar in the head, causing her instant death. The evidence will show that Johnny was picked out of a lineup by both of the witnesses to the crimes that he's accused of as being the person who shot Mrs. Lazar in the head and then fled the store in a black large sedan. So at the end of the trial, after all the evidence is entered, I will ask that you follow that evidence and reach the just verdict in this case, which is that this defendant, Johnny Hudson, is guilty beyond any reasonable doubt of Mrs. Lazar's murder, and he is guilty of attempted robbery. Thank you.